They laughed when Winifred Bast paid $40 for the marsh. Not behind her back, either. Harmon Duell laughed right there at the land registry office in Stonefall, loud enough that the clerk pretended to find something important in her drawer. He was the one who'd listed the parcel in the first place. 80 acres of muskeg and standing water out past the eastern road, land that flooded every spring and grew nothing but cattails and mosquitoes. He'd held that listing for 3 years without a single serious inquiry. Winifred signed the papers anyway. She was 24 that autumn. Her husband, Carl Bast, had died in March, a logging accident up near the Clearwater camps, the kind that happened fast and left no time for goodbyes. They'd been married 18 months. She'd come back to Stonefall to settle what little remained. A rented room above the hardware store, a mule named Porter, $312 in a postal account, and a chest of her grandfather's surveying equipment that she'd hauled from his house in Morden when he passed the winter before. The marsh cost $40, which left her $272. People in Stonefall did the arithmetic quickly, and they didn't like what it added up to. The Duell family ran the grain elevator and knew land values the way other people knew scripture. Harmon's wife, Cecile, told anyone who'd listen that the Bast widow had gone soft with grief. That marsh flooded to the tree line every April. The mosquitoes alone would drive a person out by June. There was no road in, no well, no structure standing. A woman alone on a piece of ground like that wasn't homesteading, she was disappearing. Winifred heard most of it. Stonefall was not a large town. She didn't argue. She had grown up watching her grandfather work, a man who spoke in measurements and grades rather than opinions, who believed that land told you what it was if you listened long enough. He had surveyed half the county before his eyes went, and he'd taught Winifred to read topography the way other grandfathers taught card games. She knew what the marsh was. She'd walked it twice before she signed anything. What she knew, and what Harmon Duell did not, was that the muskeg sat in a bowl. The land to the north and west ran uphill, gradual, easy to miss unless you were looking, and the water that pooled in the low ground every spring wasn't just snowmelt. It was coming from somewhere. Her grandfather had called these places Patience reservoirs. Water didn't stay where it wasn't held. Somewhere beneath that cattail ground, something was holding it. She set up her tent on a dry ridge along the southern edge in the second week of October, before the hard frost came. Porter was staked nearby with enough rope to graze the higher ground. She spent the first 3 days walking the perimeter with her grandfather's surveying rod and a composition notebook, recording what she saw. The grade of the slope, the line where sedge gave way to willow, the places where the ground felt firm underfoot, and the places where it gave slightly even in dry weather. She cataloged the insect life, the direction of water staining on the stones along the northern edge, the color of the soil at different depths when she pushed a rod down and pulled it back up. On the 4th day, she found the seep. It was in the northwest corner, where a low shelf of limestone pushed through the surface like the spine of something buried. The ground around it stayed wet, even though the rest of the marsh had dried back considerably with the autumn cool. The water that seeped from the base of that limestone shelf was cold, colder than surface water had any right to be in October, and it ran clear. She filled a jar and studied it for a long time. Then she wrote 3 pages in her notebook without stopping. She rode into Stonefall the following Friday for supplies: flour, salt, lamp oil, wire, 24 cedar posts. The woman at the dry goods counter, a Mrs. Alderton whose husband had gone to school with Carl, looked at Winifred's list and then looked at Winifred. "You're still out there," she said. It came out as something between a statement and a question. "I am," Winifred said. "Winter's coming on, I know." Mrs. Alderton wrapped the flour without further commentary, but her expression said everything Cecile Duell had already said aloud. Winifred loaded the sled, told Porter to walk on, and headed back east along the road that turned to 2 ruts and then to open ground. She built her shelter against the south face of the limestone shelf, which gave her a natural windbreak and kept the ground beneath from freezing hard until well into December. It was not a fine structure. She was clear-eyed about that. 2 walls of notched poplar, the shelf face as the back wall, a low sod roof with a smoke hole above a clay-lined firebox. Her grandfather had shown her the principle when she was 12. Heat rises, cold air settles, build low, and you keep the warmth. She slept in her bedroll and listened to the wind move through the cattails and thought about spring. By November, she had trenched a drainage channel along the north edge of the property, angling it southeast toward ground that could take the flow. The work was cold and slow, her boots wet through most days before noon. She did it section by section, cutting the frozen crust with a mattock and moving the earth with a short-handled spade. Porter watched from the ridge, with the particular patience that mules manage when they have decided something is not their problem. She was digging a secondary trench in the second week of November when she heard horses coming along the rutted track from the road. It was Harmon Duell and his brother, a younger man named Stern, who managed the elevator's grain accounts. They sat their horses at the edge of the property and looked at the drainage channel and the shelter against the limestone and the cleared ground where Winifred had cut back cattails. "Thought you'd be gone by now," Harmon said. Winifred rested the mattock handle against her shoulder. "Still here." He looked at the trench. "That's a lot of work to put into flood ground." "Ground's only flood ground if you let it flood." Stern said nothing. He was looking at the limestone shelf, at the way the seep kept a small circle of ground unfrozen despite the temperature. He had a surveyor's habit of looking. Winifred noticed it and noted it. "You can't drain this," Harmon said. "Tried it twice in the 20s. Water just comes back. Previous owners were fighting the water," Winifred said. "I'm not fighting it." Harmon made a sound that was not quite a laugh and turned his horse. Stern lingered another moment, his eyes still on the seep, then followed his brother back toward the road. Winifred went back to digging. The winter was hard, but she had expected that. She kept her provisions carefully, ate less than she wanted, tracked every pound of flour in her notebook beside the drainage measurements and soil observations. The shelter held heat better than she'd thought it would. The limestone behind her kept the cold from coming through the back wall, and on the worst nights she pulled Porter into the shelter with her, which was undignified for both of them, but effective. She read her grandfather's surveying manuals by lamplight. She had 3 of them, worn soft at the spines, annotated in his cramped handwriting. One section she had read so many times she knew it without looking. The chapters on artesian systems and aquifer structures, the way pressurized groundwater moved through porous stone, the signs that indicated a confined layer beneath. Her grandfather had found a well for a farming family in 1908 by reading the landscape the way she was reading this one. He'd never charged them for it. He'd said it wasn't his water to sell. By February, the drainage channels were complete to the degree that frozen ground allowed. She had mapped the property in her notebook with grades and contour lines and noted where the water moved when it moved. She'd taken the temperature of the seep water every week since October, and it had not varied by more than 2 degrees. That consistency was the thing. Surface water responded to weather. Deep water didn't. She wrote a letter to a geologist at the University of Manitoba, whose name she'd found in one of her grandfather's manuals. She explained what she'd observed. The seep temperature, the limestone shelf, the consistent flow regardless of surface conditions, and asked if he could tell her what she was likely looking at. She sent it with the February mail. In Stonefall that winter, the conversation about Winifred Bast had moved from mockery to something more uncomfortable, which was uncertainty. She came in for supplies every 3 weeks. She was thin but not unwell. She answered questions directly and without self-pity. She did not ask for help. The things she bought, wire, posts, seed catalogs, more composition books, suggested a person with plans rather than a person in difficulty. This was harder to dismiss than grief. Harmon Duell said she'd be out by spring. His wife said she'd probably already given up and was too proud to admit it. The clerk at the registry office, a young woman named Patricia Feld who had processed the original sale, watched Winifred load her sled every 3 weeks and said nothing to anyone. The geologist's letter arrived in March. His name was August Selby, and he wrote in the dry, careful language of his profession. But the content was plain enough. What she described was consistent with a shallow artesian aquifer, pressurized groundwater held in permeable stone beneath a confining layer of less permeable material. If the limestone shelf she described was acting as a natural outlet for that pressurized layer, the flow would be consistent year-round, temperature stable, and, depending on the depth of the aquifer, potentially substantial. He recommended a test bore at the base of the shelf. He also wrote, "I have not seen this parcel and cannot say with certainty. But the indicators you describe are not what one typically sees in simple surface drainage. You may be sitting on something significant. She read the letter twice, folded it, put it in the back of the surveying manual. Then she started planning the bore. She didn't have a drill rig. Nobody in the county had a drill rig available for hire before summer, and she couldn't wait for summer. She talked to an old man named Grantham Foss, who had dug wells by hand on the prairie before the war and still had his equipment in a shed outside town. He was 73 and hard of hearing and almost completely uninterested in the opinions of others, which made him one of the more restful people in Stonefall. She explained what she was looking for. He listened, drank his tea, and said he'd come out and have a look. He came the following week and stood at the base of the limestone shelf for a long time without speaking. Then he said the water was there and he'd help her reach it, and she should give him a week to sort his tools. The digging took most of April. Foss came out 4 days a week, sleeping in the shelter, and eating what Winifred cooked, which was plain food prepared without ceremony. He did not ask her why she was doing this alone, or what had happened to her husband. He dug with the focused, unhurried attention of someone who had spent his life working against resistance. Winifred worked beside him, learning as she went. On the 21st day, at a depth of 19 feet, the water came up, not a seep, not a slow welling. It came up fast and cold and clean, filling the bore in under 2 minutes. Foss looked at it for a while. Then he looked at Winifred. "Pressure's good," he said. "Deep layer. Probably connected to the system that runs under the escarpment north of here." Winifred said, "How much water do you think?" He shook his head in the way of someone who had learned not to put numbers on things he hadn't measured. "Enough," he said. "More than you need." She stood at the edge of the bore and looked at the water and did not say anything for a while. Her grandfather had told her once that the most reliable things in the world were usually the least visible: the water under the ground, the heat in the stone, the direction a tree leaned when it had spent years growing toward light. You had to know to look for them. She thought he would have been pleased. Spring was late that year, but when it came hard, and by May the Stonefall district was 2 weeks into a dry spell that everyone said would break soon and didn't. The creeks ran low. The dugout ponds that farmers relied on started showing mud around their edges. The Drought elevator ran its irrigation lines from the river, but the river itself was lower than anyone had seen it since before the war. By June it was a drought, not a soft shortage of rain that farmers grumble about over coffee. A real drought, the kind that turned topsoil to powder and cracked the clay in the low fields into patterns that looked like the plates of a turtle's shell. Gardens failed. Pastures went brown and stayed brown. The wells in town dropped. The Alderton family's well gave out entirely in July, and they were hauling water from the municipal cistern that was itself running short. People drove out to the river and came back with less than they'd hoped for. In Stonefall, there were meetings. Harmon Duell stood up at the first one and said the district needed to organize water rationing before things got worse. He was correct, and people listened to him, and then the meeting ended, and the rain still didn't come. Patricia Feld, the clerk from the registry office, had driven past the marsh road twice that summer and noticed that the property didn't look the same as it had in October. There was a building where the limestone shelf was, a proper building. She could see a roof line. There were fence posts. There was a garden that didn't look like it was failing. She mentioned this to her brother over supper, who mentioned it to someone else. By the 3rd week of July, Winifred Bast had 3 visitors she hadn't invited. The first was Grantham Foss, who was not a visitor so much as an ally. He came to help her manage the flow from the bore, which she'd capped and channeled into 2 hand-dug cisterns over the spring. The cisterns were full. The pressure in the aquifer had not changed with the drought because aquifer systems didn't respond to surface conditions on a season's timeline. The water underground had no knowledge of the dry summer above. The second visitor was Stern Duell. He came alone, without his brother, on a Tuesday morning. He sat his horse at the edge of her property and waited until she looked up from the garden. "I'd like to see the bore," he said. She looked at him for a moment. "You've been thinking about it since November," she said. He got off his horse. "Yes." She showed him the bore, the cisterns, the channel she'd cut to move overflow to the garden beds she'd built on the drained ground. He looked at everything carefully and asked questions that showed he understood what he was looking at. He asked her what the water output was, and she told him. He was quiet for a while. "There's a family on the North Road," he said finally. "The Percival family. Their well's been dry since June. They've got 4 children. Winifred said, "How far north?" 3 miles. She thought about it. The bore was producing more than she could use. It had been from the beginning. "They can haul from here," she said. "Tell them to come." Stern looked at her. "Just like that." "They have children," she said. "Come before 8 in the morning or after 5 in the evening, so the heat doesn't work against the water they're carrying. 2 barrels at a time." He nodded slowly. "What do you want for it?" "Nothing," she said. Then, after a pause, "Help with the south cistern wall in September. It needs shoring." The third visitor came that same week, and this one she hadn't expected. Cecile Duell came in a wagon with her daughter. She stopped at the edge of the lane and sat there for a moment without moving, which told Winifred something about how much that arrival had cost her. Winifred walked over. "I heard about the well," Cecile said. Her voice was even, which was the voice of someone being deliberately careful. "Harmon said you were letting people draw water." "Some people," Winifred said. "Anyone who needs it." Cecile looked at the property behind her, the building, the garden, the fence lines, the cisterns. She had the look of someone revising a calculation they'd thought was settled. "We didn't think you'd last the winter," she said. It was not an apology, exactly. It was something more honest than that. "I know," Winifred said. "The Alderton well is still dry. Margaret's been hauling from the cistern in town for 6 weeks. Mrs. Alderton can come here," Winifred said. "Same arrangement as the Percival family. Same hours." Cecile nodded. Her daughter, who was perhaps 11, was looking at the garden with open interest. Winifred noticed this. "You can walk through it," Winifred told her, "if you want." The girl looked at her mother, who gave the small nod that means yes in the language of children and their parents. She climbed down from the wagon and walked to the garden fence. Cecile watched her go. Then she turned back to Winifred and said something that appeared to take some effort. "You've done well here." Winifred didn't answer that directly. There was too much history in the statement to unpack at a lane end. Instead, she said, "Tell Harmon that if the district wants to talk about a shared system, bore, cisterns, distribution, I'm willing to talk. Wait until after the drought, but I'm willing." Cecile looked at her for a long moment. "He'll want to know what you want for it." Winifred had been thinking about this since June, since the day she'd capped the bore and watched the cisterns fill and understood fully what she was sitting on. She'd thought about her grandfather. She'd thought about what it meant to find something that everyone else had missed. She'd thought about the $40, and Carl's logging wages in the postal account, and the cold winter in the low shelter with Porter breathing steam beside her while the muskeg froze and Stonefall waited for her to give up. "I want a deed amendment that recognizes the water rights as attached to this property permanently," she said. "Not revocable, not conditional, recorded at the registry, and I want a seat at the table when the district discusses water management going forward." Cecile was quiet. "Not ownership of the water," Winifred said. "I know water law. I'm not trying to own what's underground. I want recognition that this property identified the resource and that any district system built on it begins from here. That's all." "That's not nothing," Cecile said. "No," Winifred agreed. "It isn't." The drought broke in September, a cold rain that came from the northwest and ran for 4 days. By then, 12 families had hauled water from the bore at regular intervals. The Percival children had spent most of August helping Winifred pull weeds from the vegetable beds in exchange for produce. And the oldest one, a 14-year-old girl, named something Winifred never caught because she went by Tess regardless, had developed a serious interest in how the cistern walls were constructed. Stern Duell came back in September with 2 other men and helped shore the south cistern wall as he'd promised. He didn't bring Harmon, and Winifred didn't ask why. The work took a day and a half, and she fed them lunch both days. A simple meal, beans and bread, and preserved tomatoes from the garden, the kind of food that got eaten without conversation because everyone was hungry, and the work had been real. Afterward, Stern lingered while the others packed the wagon. "Harmon will come around," he said. "He doesn't like being wrong. Most people don't," Winifred said. "He's not a bad man." She considered this. "I know," she said. "He thought he was being sensible, flood ground, a widow alone. Nothing there worth anything." She picked up a post hole digger and set it against the fence. "He wasn't working with the same information I had." Stern said, "What information was that?" She thought about how to answer. "My grandfather taught me that what looks useless from the road isn't always useless when you walk it," she said finally. "You have to go look. Most people don't go look." He didn't have a response to that. He nodded and climbed into the wagon and headed back toward the road. The district meeting about water infrastructure was held in October in the municipal hall in Stonefall. Winifred came in her work clothes because she'd been digging that morning and hadn't had time to change, and she sat at the long table beside Grantham Foss, who was the only other person in the room who had stood in the bore when the water came up. Harmon Duell opened the meeting. He did not look at her when he described the drought and its damage to the district. He described the aquifer in factual terms: deep layer, pressurized, consistent, without saying who had found it or what it had taken to find it. Winifred let this go. It was not the point. When it came time for discussion, she presented what she'd prepared: a sketch map of the property, the bore location, the cistern dimensions, the output measurements she'd kept since April. She spoke without inflection, the way her grandfather had spoken, as though the data made the case and didn't need ornamentation. She described what a shared distribution system might look like. She described the deed amendment she wanted. There was silence after she finished. Then a farmer named Colthurst, whose operation was north of the escarpment, and whose wife had hauled water from the bore through July and August, said, "I don't see why anyone would argue with that." There was more silence. Then a few people agreed. Harmon Duell said nothing. Patricia Feld, sitting in the clerk's chair at the end of the table, wrote everything down with the careful neutrality of someone whose job was the record. The amendment was filed in November. Winifred's name went into the registry a second time, once for the purchase, once for the water rights recognition, and Patricia Feld stamped both documents with the particular satisfaction of someone who had waited a long time to do so. The building against the limestone shelf was larger by then. Winifred had added a proper wall and a wood floor through the summer, working evenings, and the shorter days when it rained, and there was nothing else she could do outside. It was still a plain structure, but it was sound, and it kept the cold out, and it was hers. She had a garden that had produced through the worst drought in 40 years. She had 2 cisterns full of clean water. She had a bore that the district was now planning to expand with a second bore, and a shared cistern that would serve the North Road families through the winter. She had her grandfather's surveying manuals on a shelf above the firebox, their spines worn soft, and the pages marked with 30 years of pencil notes in cramped handwriting she could still read in the dark. She was 25 years old. Porter, who had been present for most of this and had opinions about very little except the quality of the hay she provided, was staked on the south ridge as usual, watching the road to Stonefall with what might have been vigilance, or might have been the ordinary blankness of a mule who had survived a difficult winter and considered the matter closed. Winifred stood at the edge of the bore on the last warm afternoon of the year and looked at the water that came up cold and clear and consistent, as it had since April, as it would through the winter and the spring beyond it, regardless of what happened at the surface. Her grandfather had told her that the land rewarded patience and attention and the willingness to walk out and look at a thing before you decided what it was. He had said it about rocks, about grades, about the tilt of a field that would drain or wouldn't. He had said it about people too, though more rarely, and always with the qualifier that people were harder to read than land, because they moved around more. She thought he'd been right about most of it. The light went low along the limestone, and the seep kept running, quiet and cold, and entirely indifferent to what the town had thought of a widow with $40 and a notebook and a mule in the autumn of the previous year. She closed her notebook. She went inside.